All right, pre-AP biology. We are going to finish Unit 2 today, and we are going to conclude our discussion about the biogeochemical cycles. Yesterday, we talked about the nitrogen cycle. That's a really big one, so make sure again that you look over your notes or rewatch the lecture video and really learn that terminology with all those steps that are involved with the nitrogen cycle. Now, again, today we're going to focus on the other two cycles, which are a little bit shorter. They're a little bit easier to understand than the nitrogen cycle, but again, there's vocabulary involved, there's terminology, so we need to make sure that we study these notes. If you're at home and you have a link to the fill in notes, again, if you want to print those out at home, you're more than welcome to. If you don't have a printer, then you can just study either the video or the PowerPoint slides, whichever one will help you, or maybe both. All right, so we're going to start today just kind of reviewing this term, biogeochemical. And again, these are cycles, so we're talking about matter, moving, either carbon or water or nitrogen, and it's moving, amongst biological organisms, the earth, and there's even chemical processes that are involved in some of these cycles as well. So there's like a biology component, a geology component, and a chemistry component to these cycles. That's why we call them biogeochemical. And again, we're going to be studying three of these. We did the nitrogen cycle yesterday. Today, we're going to start off with the water cycle, also known as the hydrologic cycle. And we're also going to talk about the carbon cycle today. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the water cycle first. Let's first kind of understand some of the importances of water. Water is a basic cellular need, right? Our cells have to have it. In fact, cells are made up of about 70 to 75% water. So every cell in your body has water in it. So we have to drink water every single day. Water is a greenhouse gas, water vapor. So we talked about this a little bit earlier in the year. These greenhouse gases that build up in the atmosphere, they're really important to keep our climate warm, or keep our planet warm. And if it gets too warm, that means there's too many greenhouse gases. But greenhouse gases are important nonetheless. It's also important just for geological purposes. Water helps to weather or to break down rock, which helps to create soil, which contributes to other cycles like the nitrogen cycle, for example. And just for agricultural purposes, to have soil, that's a good thing to plant crops in, and feed the world and all that kind of stuff, right? All right, now as far as the cycle goes, this one's not really too difficult. I'm going to move myself over here. We're going to start over here with the sun. The sun is kind of the driving force behind the entire cycle, because it's what provides heat for our planet. And the surface of our planet, there's a ton of water on it, whether it be in the oceans or lakes and rivers and things like that. But the sun is what causes evaporation. So all of this surface water that we have, has the potential to evaporate. It doesn't have to be hot out to evaporate. I mean, as long as it's above freezing, water can evaporate. Of course, it evaporates faster if it's warmer, but I mean, it can be a cold day, let's say 40 degrees outside, and you can still have water that evaporates, right? So when water does evaporate, it goes from a liquid to a gas. So, this arrow here, this pointing up, is showing you how water vapor gets into the atmosphere. Now, there's a couple of other ways that it can get up into the atmosphere as well, besides just evaporating from like surface water. It can also evaporate from the soil. There's water that's in the soil, and it can just evaporate that way, and it can get up there as well. It can also evaporate from the leaves of plants. We have a special name for that. It's called transpiration, which is on the next slide. But all three of these things, essentially, you've got liquid water that's turning into a gas, so that's evaporation. All right, so you'll notice the three different arrows there pointing up into the atmosphere. Now, of course, whatever comes up can come down, right? So this big arrow here is showing us how water can get back to the surface. So it gets back through precipitation, whether it be rainfall or snow. Snow is a solid form of precipitation, but anyway, it can come back down to earth. Now, this is where the cycle gets kind of interesting because once it gets back to the earth, then a couple of different things can happen to that water. Think about, let's say, for example, let's say it rains today. It rains for, let's say, 3 or 4 hours. So you get a lot of water that comes down to the planet. So one of the things that can happen to that water is it can just run off the surface. It can just run off into rivers and lakes, right? So, a lot of our water just does that. It just kind of goes right back into where it originally came from, either a lake, a river, or the ocean. So we call that surface runoff. So that's one thing that can happen to the water once it reaches the earth. Another thing that can happen to it is it can be taken up by plants, right? Plants can absorb it. In fact, a lot of the water, especially like in a forest ecosystem, a lot of that water actually just gets taken in by plants. We call that uptake. Uptake is just the absorption of water from the soil by plants. Now, the third thing that can happen to it is something called infiltration. Infiltration means that it just kind of penetrates through the soil. We call that percolation. It's kind of moves its way through soil, and it can accumulate, in these big reservoirs underwater. It's called groundwater. So when this occurs, we can get a source of fresh water that just accumulates underneath the surface. Okay, so I want you to remember, how does water get into the air? How does it come down? And what are three things that can happen to that water, once it reaches the surface? Okay, so that's pretty critical and pretty important. So this is just kind of a summary of some of the terminology that I want you to understand. All right, evaporation, liquid water to water vapor to water gas. Transpiration is the evaporation from leaves of plants, so it's kind of a type of evaporation. Condensation, okay, that's when water gas turns into liquid water. That happens up in the atmosphere. And then precipitation is when the water comes back down to earth. Infiltration, that's when the water goes into the ground. Runoff, that's where it moves into another body of water. Uptake, that's where it's taken in by plants. And the term groundwater is just water that's stored under the ground. So make sure we're familiar with those terms. Okay. I always like to talk about the impact that humans have on the cycles. We talked about this yesterday with the nitrogen cycle. I want to talk about it with the water cycle as well. What do humans do to kind of impact this? One of the things that we do is we overuse water, right? Water is an essential need, but we use it for personal reasons in our homes. We wash our cars and all that kind of stuff. But in a lot of cases, we end up overusing this resource. There's only so much fresh water on the planet. There's a lot of salt water, but as far as fresh water goes, there's only so much. So if we overuse that, that's a resource we kind of have to kind of be careful with. We divert water. We move it from one area to another. We typically do that again because we use this water for things like human consumption, but we have the ability to move water from one area of the planet to another. We pollute water. We put chemicals in it. We talked about eutrophication yesterday, which is kind of a type of pollution, which can cause algae blooms and dead zones and all that type of stuff. We can reduce infiltration. If you take a look at this picture on the bottom right here, you get this big, huge parking lot, right? Think about what's underneath that parking lot is soil, right? Soil is permeable. It'll allow water to go through it, but we've replaced that soil, or we've built on top of the soil kind of an impermeable surface, right? So like if it rains, the water is just going to puddle up on top of this cement, and it's not going to be able to get into the ground. So the more of these types of surfaces that we construct, pavement and parking lots and sidewalks, those things actually reduce the amount of water that can get into soil, and it actually increases the amount of evaporation that occurs. So that actually does impact the water cycle quite a bit, all these impervious surfaces. Another thing is deforestation. This picture on the left, cutting down forested area, whatever, that really impacts transpiration. right, which is a type of evaporation. So by removing all of these trees, not only do we decrease the amount of water that can evaporate, but if there's less water in the atmosphere, that means there's going to be less rainfall. So that actually can change the weather. If you think about it, deforestation has an impact on climate and weather patterns around the world. It also, by removing trees, it impacts the soil. It impacts how much water can infiltrate and go into the soil. It can impact runoff, surface runoff. If you remove all these trees, that water can no longer be absorbed, so it's going to just run off the surface, and it could cause flooding, in some areas. So, deforestation has been known to actually cause flooding in different regions around the world, all because we've just removed the trees. All right, so make sure we're familiar again with some of those terms and some of those ways that humans impact the water cycle. All right, now the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle again. There's some reasons why carbon is important. One of the biggest things, I suppose, is that it's the main ingredient of organic compounds. Things that make up our bodies, things that we need, things like fats and proteins, nucleic acids. That's DNA. So carbon is a major component of our genetic material. But it also exists on our planet in different forms. Most of the time, carbon just doesn't exist by itself. It exists as things like carbon dioxide gas, methane gas, which these are all greenhouse gases, calcium carbonate, which is in the oceans, fossil fuels, things like natural gas, oil, coal. These are all things that we use as energy resources. But again, they're all made primarily of carbon. Processes in the carbon cycle. Carbon again is found in so many different places, and because it's found in all these different areas, it kind of cycles again back and forth between living and non-living things. Again, it's found in the bodies of all living things. It's found up in the atmosphere. It's found in the permafrost and the tundra. The tundra, permafrost is like frozen soil, and there's a ton of carbon. It's in the form of methane gas that's actually in that permafrost. And one of the big fears that we have with this is, with global warming, a lot of that permafrost is melting. And when it melts, it releases all of this methane gas, which is a carbon based compound. And it's also a greenhouse gas. So when that goes up into the atmosphere, it actually warms our planet. So, I mean, by warming the tundra, it actually releases this gas, which causes the planet to get even warmer. So it's this like positive feedback loop that's like really difficult to control. It's found in the ocean. It's found in fossil fuels. We talked about this, and it's also a major component of the photosynthetic, cellular respiration cycle that we've talked about in previous units. So again, this is all ways or all different, I guess, processes that involve carbon. All right, now a carbon sink. We talked about nitrogen sinks yesterday. This is just areas where we find carbon in large amounts. A couple things to remember here. The ocean. It is the largest carbon sink that there is. There is more carbon in the ocean than there is anywhere else on our planet. So it is the largest sink. Like now with the nitrogen cycle from yesterday, remember the biggest sink is the atmosphere. That's where most of our nitrogen is. Forests are also sinks. They're kind of terrestrial sinks. There's a lot of carbon that's stored in plants, for example. Um, so yeah, just kind of remember, carbon sinks, ocean, the biggest one. Forests are also pretty big, but again, the ocean is the largest carbon sink that there is. Okay, now for the actual cycle. Now I see that you can see there's a lot going on here. Okay, but we're going to kind of break this diagram down into a couple of different components. And you'll notice that kind of on the left-hand side is kind of the aquatic, kind of the ocean component of the cycle. And then over here on the right, we kind of have our land-based component of the cycle. So I'm going to kind of split this down the middle, and I want to kind of focus first on the ocean. Okay, and then we'll kind of come over here to the land. So again, you'll notice that there is atmospheric carbon, right? We have carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere. And again, the atmosphere is also a sink. It's not the biggest sink, but there is some carbon dioxide in the air. But how does that carbon dioxide get into the ocean? Because the ocean is the largest sink. So I want you to look at a couple of arrows here. One of these arrows is leading down to the plant, right? You have algae and we have aquatic plants. Well, those are photosynthetic organisms, right? So anything that photosynthesizes is going to absorb a carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's one way that carbon can get into the ocean is just through photosynthesis. Now, another way that we can get um, carbon dioxide into the ocean is just through the process of dissolving. Sometimes carbon dioxide just dissolves directly into the ocean. So that's a kind of a minor way that it happens, but it happens all the time. So you've got photosynthesis bringing in carbon, you've got dissolving bringing in carbon, and the third way is just through animal respiration. You've got animals that live in the ocean, right? And like fish or mammals or whatever it is, those animals take in oxygen and they release carbon dioxide. So a lot of that carbon dioxide actually stays in the ocean. All right. Now they also release some of that into the atmosphere. So that's kind of how some of that CO2 can get back into the air. But a lot of it just builds up in the ocean. So what ends up happening is we get a lot of carbon dioxide that accumulates in the ocean. So again, this is why it's such a big sink and a big reservoir of carbon dioxide. Now, just kind of like yesterday, we talked about this. Anything that's living, plants or animals, is eventually going to die, right? So at the bottom of the ocean, we have a lot of decomposing organisms. That's what these guys are here. You'll notice the arrows that are kind of leading from the animals and the plants. It's kind of pointing down to the decomposers. So those organisms will break down all the dead plants and animals. I mean, think about how big the ocean is and how many things die and how much decomposition there is. There's just a ton of it. Now, once those organisms get decomposed, one of two things can happen to them. One of them is they can be converted into something called limestone. Limestone is a solid, it's kind of like a rock. It's called calcium carbonate. You'll notice that there's carbon in it. And this sediment just builds up on the bottom of the ocean. So the bottom of the ocean floor, is just basically millions of years worth of limestone that has just been accumulating and accumulating at the bottom of the ocean. So again, one of the reasons why carbon is such a big sink is not only because of all the carbon dioxide that's in the ocean, but also because of all this carbon-based compound called limestone that's in the ocean as well. Now, another thing that can happen to dead plants and animals is they can be turned into oil and natural gas. You notice this arrow here. This is called burial. Again, when those things get decomposed, whatever doesn't get decomposed just kind of builds up on the ocean floor, and that can get buried in sediment over time, and it can turn into natural gas deposits or oil deposits. And those things can be extracted and used as a fuel source, which we'll get into in a few minutes. All right, so that kind of ends just the ocean part of the cycle. Now I want to go over here to the land-based cycle, or kind of the land-based component of the cycle. And we see a lot of very similar things. I mean, for example, how does carbon come out of the atmosphere? There are plants on land, right? There's a whole bunch of plants on land that just absorb that carbon dioxide. Of course, there's animals that live on land as well, and they just respirate and they put carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere. But again, all these plants and animals, the same thing in the ocean. I mean, they decompose and they can be turned into oil and natural gas. They can also be turned into coal. Now, coal is mainly formed from land processes, whereas like limestone is mainly formed by oceanic processes. And oil and natural gas are kind of both. So that's why you see the arrows pointing to both. But again, coal is a fossil fuel. We extract that to generate electricity and things like that. Which, if you take my AP environmental class, you'll learn a heck of a lot more about that process. But anyway, these are all just fossil fuels that build up under the atmosphere. Now, how does carbon get back up into the air? A couple different. Look at all these arrows that are leading, or that are pointing up into the atmosphere. So again, we talked about respiration. That's animal respiration. Decomposers also respirate. All right, so they're like little animals as well. Even though a lot of them are bacteria and things like that, but they can produce CO2. Um, Forest fires. This has been in the news quite a bit recently, right? Anytime plants burn, they release all that carbon dioxide that they take in through photosynthesis, right? Forests are a big sink of carbon, and when they burn, they release a tremendous amount of CO2 back into the atmosphere. Now, the other ways are basically through fossil fuels, right? We can extract those fossil fuels and then we burn them. When you burn coal or oil or natural gas, those things go back into the atmosphere as well. Remember, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So the more of that we put up into the air, then the warmer our planet's going to become. So this is becoming a real big issue, right? 7.8 billion people, a lot of them are driving cars. So the more of those automobiles we have, the more CO2 we're going to have up into the atmosphere. And then finally, farming. Anytime the soil gets disrupted, it was mainly through agricultural means. There's a lot of carbon in the soil, carbon dioxide. And when that soil gets turned over, like through farming, for example, then we release a lot of that carbon back into the atmosphere. So I want us to know some different ways that carbon gets into the air on land. I want us to know some of the ways that carbon gets into the air in the ocean. And then I want us to know how that carbon gets pulled out of the air by different processes, again, both in the ocean and on land. All right, human impacts on the cycle. Two really big ones, guys, that you have to know. One of them is fossil fuel use. Whenever we extract fossil fuels, we're decreasing those sinks in the planet, whether it be in the ocean or whether it be on land. And we're also, increasing how much carbon dioxide is in the air. This is a big reason why we have a global warming issue on our planet. The other one is deforestation, right? When we remove forests, when we remove plants, we remove those organisms that are bringing in carbon dioxide and pulling the carbon out of the air. So, I mean, think about these two processes alone. Think about how bad they both are, right? When we burn fossil fuels, we put that carbon into the air. When we remove forested land, we remove the ability to pull the carbon out of the air. So these kind of combined are really a big global problem when it comes to global warming. These are two things that we have to kind of slow down. And if we don't, we're never going to stop the problem of global warming, if we don't focus on these two things. All right, guys, that's it for me today. This was kind of a long PowerPoint, but again, make sure that you watch this again and study your notes. All right, have a good day, everybody.